The last lecture left open the possibility that there are truly indeterministic things at the level of physical quantum events. Even if there are indeterministic quantum events, though, it would obviously only matter to free will insofar as the indeterminism is implicated in decision-making. If there are indeterminist events, but they only happen in black holes or in events that never rise to the level of the mental, then that isn't going to help. So what we really want to know is whether our decision-making or our behavior reveals some kind of indeterminism, reveals some kind of influence of non-deterministic processes. Work in an area called game theory has been used to argue that we should in fact expect animals to behave in random ways. And this in turn has inspired neuroscientific work examining the underpinnings of such apparently indeterminist behavior. So I want to start by talking about the animal work in game theory. So the research on animal behavior has been guided by the idea that animals are well designed for solving particular kinds of natural problems, like getting the maximal amount of food in various circumstances. When presented with fairly complicated problems for determining which food source is best, animals do remarkably well. So let me just describe one experiment. So this experiment involved birds watching worms go by on a conveyor belt. And the worms came in two sizes, large and small. The worms also had a piece of tape on them that had to be removed by the bird before the bird could eat it. The experimenters could vary the rate at which the worms came by using the conveyor belt, and that way they could see how the birds would solve the problem of getting the most food given the time pressure that was produced by how fast the conveyor belt was going, how quickly the worms were appearing. What they found was that birds that were slow at removing the tape would learn to skip the small worms and wait for the big ones, because that was the best payoff for them. That meant they got the most big worms, the most wormy stuff overall. But the birds don't perform perfectly. They make what you might think of as mistakes. That is, sometimes the birds would go for the small worms even when this made them miss out on a big worm later. One explanation for this is that the animals are just making processing mistakes. Often in psychology, we're presented with data that don't quite conform to our predictions. And in many cases, we assume that the leftover variation in the responses comes from what psychologists would call noise. These are extraneous factors that impair performance. So the extraneous factors might be from the environment, or they might be from inside the organism. In experiments like this, the bird and worm experiment, a natural explanation for why the birds don't always maximize their intake is that the bird gets distracted or confused sometimes. And this is analogous to something familiar from people. So if you give people a speeded exam in which you tell them they have to solve 1,000 multiplication problems, and all the problems are multiplying 2 3-digit numbers by hand, people are likely to make some mistakes. But this isn't because they're incapable of doing the problems typically, but rather because they get fatigued or distracted or annoyed at the person for making them do something so tedious. This is just noise. It might not tell us anything particularly interesting about a person's mathematical abilities. Similarly, we might say that what's happening when the birds take the small worm is that they're just fatigued or distracted or annoyed at the stupid conveyor belt. But another possibility is that the apparent mistakes reveal a deeper feature of animal decision-making. Maybe the birds are actually behaving in ways that would be good if they were done in their natural environment. So maybe this isn't something that's driven by distraction, but is driven by a deep feature of birdie psychology. Maybe they would perform this way even if we ensured that the bird was not distracted or fatigued or annoyed or somehow influenced by extraneous factors. In that case, we'd be forced to acknowledge that something more interesting is going on. It wouldn't be just noise that was producing the bird's responses. Paul Glimcher, a neuroscientist at NYU, has been one of the leading researchers exploring this possibility by considering the connections between economics and neuroscience. This is now known as neuroeconomics, or the neuroscience of decision-making. Game theory is a branch of economic theory, and it provides reason to think that sometimes the best course of action would be to be unpredictable. Game theory was born out of a limitation of traditional economic theory, which typically focused on how an individual should decide based on the facts before her. So you could just look at the facts that the individual faces and the various things that she cares about, and then calculate what the outcome will be for each action, because what you're looking at is what will maximize what she cares about given the facts that are presented to her. But in many cases, the facts before the agent are unclear. In particular, the outcome for a particular action will often depend on what other people do. In such contexts, we can think of individuals as players in a game where you have to tailor your responses to what the other person does, the other person's move. The movie A Beautiful Mind was about one of the major figures in game theory, John Nash, who, at least according to the movie, used game theory to pick up women in bars. One example of a game that has been much studied experimentally is known as the ultimatum game. In this game, one person, who's known as the proposer, is given a pot of money that he's supposed to split with another player who's known as the responder. If the responder accepts the proposal, then both players get to keep the money. If the responder rejects the proposal, then neither gets any money. So here, let's say the proposer is given $10, and they tell him, you need to split this with the responder however you want. If the responder accepts, then you both get the money. If he doesn't, then you don't. So let's say the proposer is trying to decide, should I give him $5? Should I give him $4? Should I give him $1? Well, the proposer's action, the best action for the proposer, will depend on what the responder will do. If the responder would reject a low offer, let's say you give him $1, then the proposer had better not offer $1 or he won't get anything. As a matter of fact, there have now been dozens of experiments on this, and in the West at least, subjects do tend to reject low offers. So if the proposer offers him $1, then typically people will say, no, I'd rather not have $1 than let you have such a disproportionate amount. And maybe because people anticipate this, proposers typically offer 50-50 splits, which are, of course, typically accepted. Now, this is a good example of a game because it's obvious that the outcome for oneself as a proposer depends hugely on the behavior of the other person, and you need to anticipate the other person's behavior and think about it. But the game theoretic point that's more interesting for our purposes is that for some games, it turns out that the best course of action is to behave in ways that are unpredictable by the other person. John Maynard Smith, an economist who lived from 1920 to 2004, developed this idea with an example of a game that he called hawks and doves. He says, take a species of animals that compete for territory. Imagine also that the animals are roughly matched for strength. So when there's a confrontation between two animals, each individual can either fight, that is, be a hawk, or retreat, that is, be a dove. Fighting will lead to injury, so it's costly, but retreating means giving up territory, which is also costly. What Maynard Smith showed was that in some of these games, if you adjust the costs right, if the cost of fighting is high and the cost of retreating is also high, then the best strategy is to be unpredictable. At least some of the time, it will be smart to be a dove because you can only sustain so many injuries. But it would be bad if the other animal knew when you were going to be a dove. If the other animal knows when you're going to be a dove, he'll most certainly be a hawk and get the territory. Maynard Smith maintains that this presents a kind of evolutionary argument for random behavior, and he says, quote, if it were selectively advantageous, a randomizing device could surely evolve. That is, if behaving randomly gave animals an evolutionary advantage, evolution might have contrived to make animals behave randomly. The critical point here is that behaving indeterministically might actually make sense in evolutionary terms. Maynard Smith's observation about evolution is intriguing, but when it comes to evolutionary arguments, saying that evolution might have produced some trait doesn't show that evolution actually did that. And there are two major reasons why an evolutionary argument like this might not go through. Remember, what Maynard Smith presents is he says, if you had this kind of scenario where you had these particular cost-benefit ratios, then indeterministic behavior would be the best way to play the game. But it's possible that there never were any such scenarios with those exact kinds of ratios that would have generated this. Now, the indeterminist response in that case wouldn't emerge if that particular game never emerged. There'd be no evolutionary pressure for the indeterminist response unless there was the situation that would give rise to it. The second and more general reason why an evolutionary argument might not go through is just that evolution doesn't produce the best of all possible organisms. So simply because it would be good in evolutionary terms for an animal to have a trait doesn't mean that the animal will have the trait. Sometimes it's too costly for evolution to build the trait and maintain it, and sometimes there are developmental constraints that evolution has to work with what it has, so it has to work with the organism that's in place, and there's only a certain range of possibilities that are open for evolution to work on. Given the raw materials, it just might not have been an option for the trait to evolve, for any given trait that you think, wow, it'd be great for an organism to have this. Just to take one example for us, it would have been really nice if evolution had thought to build separate tubes in us for food and for speech. That way we wouldn't be so susceptible to choking. But that just wasn't in the cards because what evolution had to work with didn't allow for such a bifurcated structure. So, while Maynard Smith has definitely made an important argument for why it's quite possible that there was an evolutionary advantage to behaving indeterministically, that isn't enough to conclude that in fact animals behave indeterministically because evolution built them that way. We'd need to look at evidence to see whether or not animals really do behave in indeterministic ways. In a classic experiment, a zoologist at Cambridge University dispersed food to a flock of 33 mallards that were spending the summer in the winter of 1979 to 1980 on a lake at Cambridge. It's such a great idea for an experiment. You're just sitting in your office and you say, oh, let's go down to the lake and feed some ducks. Well, two experimenters took up spots near the lake. One of them threw out pieces, or each of them threw out pieces of bread, but one of them threw out a piece of bread every 10 seconds, and the other one threw a piece of bread every 20 seconds. Now that means that, on the one hand, there's twice as much food delivered at one location. But if all the ducks go to that spot where he's throwing out bread every 10 seconds, then a lot of food will get neglected where the guy's still throwing out food, it's just half as often. And notice that this kind of foraging, the animals are foraging effectively, is a game in a sense that what is best for an individual depends on the behavior of others. So if 32 of the birds, of the 33 birds, go to the high payoff site, the 10-second site, then the one remaining individual gets this huge advantage by going to the low payoff site. He gets all the food at that other site. So for the maximal amount of food consumption, the optimal outcome would be if 1/3 of the ducks were at the low payoff site and 2/3 were at the high payoff site. So what happened in the experiment? Well, in fact, they found precisely this optimal pattern. At the high payoff site, there tended to be 22 ducks, and at the low payoff site, 11 ducks. Now that's a pretty cool finding. But what's especially interesting for our purposes is how this happened. It wasn't that 22 ducks settled into one spot and 11 into the other. Rather, what happened was that the ducks were moving back and forth. Each duck spent approximately 2/3 of his time at the high payoff site, and 1/3 of the time at the low payoff site. But which duck would move when was quite unpredictable. Now that is really interesting. Let's consider it a bit further though. What would happen if you got an animal alone? Maybe what we find with the ducks is that they're sensitive to the behavior of the other ducks. In that case, they shouldn't do this kind of thing when you get them on their own with no other ducks around. If you get them on their own with no other ducks around, they should just always go to the high payoff site. This kind of question was explored in rats a couple of decades ago, and more recently with monkeys. In an experiment that was conducted by Paul Glimcher, whom I mentioned earlier, and colleagues, they took thirsty monkeys and trained the monkeys to look straight ahead at a visual stimulus. Then the monkeys would be shown two peripheral visual items, one to the left and the other to the right. The monkey would get juice when he looked at these stimuli, but now the experimenters could vary how much the monkey would get depending on which direction he looked. That is, the monkey can learn from this how much juice he gets depending on whether he looks right or left. So let's suppose that the monkey gets 1 drop of juice if he looks to the left and 2 drops of juice if he looks to the right. You might think that once the monkey figures this out, he'll only look to the right because that will maximize his juice intake. And apparently, that is just the best thing ever if you're a monkey, the juice. What they found in the experiment was that the monkeys actually behaved much like the ducks in the earlier experiment. The monkeys would continue to look both left and right, both to the left and to the right, but they would do it in a way that matched the payoffs. So if the monkey gets 1 drop for the left and 2 for the right, then he would look to the right twice as often as he looked to the left. But he would look to the left a third of the time. Now, why would the monkey do this? Well, the most natural explanation is that the brain mechanisms that produce this behavior were shaped by the fact that the animals were usually competing with other animals for food. There were usually other monkeys around trying to get the food. And when there are other animals around, the optimal strategy will be to behave in this way. The optimal strategy will be to match one's behavior to the ratio of the payoffs. In normal circumstances in the wild, the animal will get more food if it adopts this strategy. In that context, it makes sense to use this kind of a method. A large and interesting part of the explanation here is competition. We can suppose that when animals evolved to have these traits, the crucial factor was competition for food. Because of this, the experiment with the ducks really reveals the system doing its thing in the right way. The monkey, or the animals, in this case the ducks, were competing with each other for food. And if most of the ducks were neglecting the low payoff site, then you'd get a great advantage by heading over there to get the extra food. But of course, all of the ducks are in this situation, and so they all take advantage of the low payoff site. The animals in these studies behave in ways that are, as I said, as a matter of fact, unpredictable. The observer can't predict what's going to happen. But it isn't entirely clear that the goal of the behavior is to be unpredictable. The evolutionary advantage in the food foraging case is just that you want to get the food that might otherwise be neglected. From that, it doesn't follow that being unpredictable is an important part. What's important is getting all the food that's available, getting the distribution right for yourself. But what we're particularly interested in here is whether you get animals behaving in ways that are unpredictable because it's really good to be unpredictable, where it's essential to be unpredictable to get the good thing. With humans, we have lots of games like this, so consider rock, paper, scissors. If you behave in a predictable way in that game, say you always choose paper, you'll get creamed. You have to behave in ways that can't be predicted by your opponent. Now, you might think that no game that involves unpredictability could be simpler than rock, paper, scissors. But game theorists developed a game that was even simpler. That's called matching pennies. And this game works as follows. We each hold out a penny, and if the pennies are both showing the same side, that is, if they match, then I win. If they don't match, then you win. So let's say you're playing this game against a computer. The computer will gather information about how often you're choosing heads and how often you're choosing tails. And if you show a pattern, the computer will take advantage of that. As a result, the best strategy is to be unpredictable. And when you put people in games like this with computers, people are really good at it. Recently, some different research teams became interested in how monkeys would perform on tasks that were like the matching pennies task. Obviously, they couldn't do it with pennies because monkeys aren't that cooperative. So different techniques were adopted. And again, this particular experiment that I'll describe used a perceptual decision task. So in one of these studies, the monkeys were shown a small yellow square in the center of a computer screen with 2 green discs that appeared on either side of the square. Then the yellow square disappeared, and the monkey would shift its gaze either left or right. And the monkey got rewarded if it looked at the same disc, either left or right, that was selected by the computer. So that's like the matching pennies game. But of course, the computer was programmed so that it would select the opposite disc from the monkey. So it was programmed to detect patterns in the monkey's behavior and take advantage of them. So for the monkey to succeed, it needed to be unpredictable very much in the way we need to be unpredictable in the matching pennies game. And the monkeys were excellent at this game. In important respects, the monkeys behaved just like people in the related games. Now, with knowledge of this in hand, now that we know that animals can learn to be unpredictable, it's easy to think of cases in the wild where it would in fact be good to be unpredictable. Of course, there's the Maynard Smith hawk-dove style scenario, but more vividly, consider predator-prey scenarios. If a given zebra always darted to the right, then the lion would have a much easier time anticipating the motion and getting the zebra. On the other hand, if the lion always attacks at the same time every day, then the zebra can learn when not to go to the water hole. So both of them need to be unpredictable to maximize their success in living in the one case and eating in the other. The animal work shows that animals do behave in unpredictable ways. But of course, this doesn't show that the animals are doing anything that's genuinely indeterminist. It's possible that their behavior looks indeterminist, but there is a perfectly deterministic process that gives rise to this. So we need to get a closer look at the neural underpinnings of the behaviors. In a series of experiments, they had monkeys watch a display consisting of hundreds of randomly moving dots. In some trials, the dots on average move to the left. On other trials, the dots on average move to the right. And the monkey's job is to show that they know which way the dots are moving. If the dots are moving to the left, the monkey gets rewarded if he looks at the spot on the left. And again, the reward is berry fruit juice. So the researchers measured what happens during this task. Again, the monkey's task is to look to the left if the dots on the whole are moving to the left, look to the right if the dots on the whole are moving to the right on average. And they measured what happened to neurons in the visual area called MT for middle temporal. It's a region near the back of the brain that's known to process visual information about motion. They also measured activity in neurons in an area forward in the brain, an area known as the lateral intraparietal area, or LIP, and that's near the side of the head toward the front of the brain. Area LIP is known to be important to decisions about where to look, which, after all, is the decision the monkey's making. Indeed, LIP may well be the critical brain site where the monkey's perceptual decision is made. So we can think of this as, at least tentatively, as the perceptual decision area. In the visual area MT, some neurons respond to leftward motion and others to rightward motion. That already seems kind of cool to me, that some neurons are specific to leftward motion and some are specific to rightward motion. Well, area LIP takes information from those opposing groups of neurons and integrates that information. So it takes information from the leftward neurons and the rightward neurons that are in the visual area, and if the rightward neurons are more highly activated, then there's an increase in activation in the LIP neurons that correspond to rightward eye movements, and a decrease in LIP neurons that correspond to leftward eye movements. So let me restate that. The idea is that when the dots move to the rightward neurons are more highly activated, and this in turn leads to increased activation in LIP neurons that correspond to the eyes moving to the right. And then at a certain point, LIP neurons from moving the eyes in a particular direction, reach a critical level of activation and cause the eye to move. So to repeat this from the other direction, the monkey's eyes move to the right when LIP neurons for rightward eye movement are highly activated. What makes those neurons activate so highly is the high activation of neurons in the visual area that detect rightward movement. So now we get a nice causal chain. The computer shows dots moving on balance to the right. This leads to greater activation of rightward neurons. This information gets sent to LIP and generates high activation for neurons associated with rightward eye movement, and then this seems to result in the monkey looking to the right. Now, for us, the really interesting question is, what happens when the randomly moving dots don't move in any systematic direction? In that case, the visual input that the monkey gets is exactly the same. So what happens to the LIP neurons in that case? What happens is that the LIP neurons, the decision neurons apparently, exhibit slight variations in activation. And these variations are correlated with different eye movements. That is, when there's slightly more activation in LIP neurons corresponding to rightward eye movements, then monkeys are more likely to look to the right. To recap just this point, in these trials, the monkey is getting visual inputs of the dots moving around, but there's no overall trend for motion to the right or the left. It's completely random, but they're getting the same random input in various trials. So they have several trials, the input is exactly the same in the different trials. It will look random, of course, but again, it's the same random motion, apparently random motion in the different trials, because it's generated by the same computer program. Nonetheless, the neural activity associated with the decision varies across these visually identical trials. The monkeys, at least from the retina, are getting exactly the same input, but the neurons associated with the decisions are responding differently. At first blush, this looks like good evidence that the LIP neurons are responding indeterministically. However, it remains unclear exactly how this unpredictability emerges in the neural chain of events. It's possible that it comes from differences in the information that gets received by these LIP neurons. That is, it might be that the perceptual neurons in MT send slightly different signals to the LIP neurons, and those slight differences in the signals tip LIP neurons one way or another. There are also massive additional connections from LIP neurons to other neurons, so it's possible that the variation enters there. We don't yet know what produces the unpredictable behavior of these neurons in these conditions. And in effect, we face a question similar to one that we faced at the beginning of the lecture. Is the unpredictable behavior of these neurons just an instance of noise from the environment or from other neurons? Or are these neurons somehow built to respond in a random way? Are they built so that they will respond randomly even when they get equivocal input? We don't have an answer to this question at this point. But at a minimum, there certainly is not a psychological explanation in terms of reasons or thoughts or anything like that for why the LIP neurons respond the way they do. Now, recall the story of Björden's ass from Lecture 5. In that example, the donkey starves because he can't find a reason to prefer one pile of hay over the other. The work that we've just considered suggests that this just wouldn't happen. Animals do exhibit random behavior when faced with exactly the same visual input. And there might be an evolutionary explanation for this as well. Presumably, natural selection wouldn't preserve donkeys that behaved like the ones in Björden's example. An animal that froze up under conditions of equal payoff would be a doomed animal. That still doesn't tell us how the problem was solved by natural selection. Again, it might be that the neural system already has enough noise in it that you never have to worry about the brain being incapable of action when two competing options are equally attractive. On the other hand, as Maynard Smith suggested, perhaps natural selection built animals to respond in random ways. Now, does this count as free will? The kind of randomness that we might have in the neural case, assume that we have randomness? Well, there are two different kinds of reasons to be skeptical. So it's random in some sense. Well, let's suppose that it's random in this, the behaviors are effectively indeterministic and unpredictable at the neural level. So at the level of the neurons, that doesn't yet show genuine indeterminism, for it's possible that at a lower level analysis, what looks like indeterminism is really generated by deterministic processes. So one thing we know is that if you completely isolate a neuron from the network and you use a microelectrode to stimulate it, then the output of that neuron will in fact be completely predictable. Across trials, the neuron will respond in exactly the same way when stimulated with the same amount of voltage. But the communication between neurons seems to defy deterministic explanation. Neurons communicate via synapses, which are basically the connecting joints between neurons. Synapse, the word, was formed from Greek words for clasp together. And in a synapse, chemicals, that are neurotransmitters, are released at the end of one neuron across a tiny gap to another neuron. The interesting thing is that the release of the neurotransmitters is unpredictable. Given the same input, the same synapse can release more or fewer neurotransmitting chemicals. So here it looks like we have indeterministic behavior in the broad sense. The same input to the same thing can produce different outputs. However, it's still possible that when scientists take a closer look at exactly what happens in the synapse, they'll be able to identify features that differ across the different trials, showing that what seems to be indeterministic really can be accommodated. This is all currently very much up in the air, but it's worth noting that some theorists maintain that the indeterminism of the synapse might well be explained by indeterminism at the quantum level. A perhaps deeper problem for this issue of indeterminism and neuroscience is that it's unclear that the kind of indeterminism that's suggested in the neuroscience decision is the kind that we want and maybe think we need for free will. For it's hard to see how these processes give us control. It's instructive even that the neuroscientists and people like Maynard Smith regard the indeterminacy as randomness. Indeed, viewed from the perspective of game theory, it's randomness, not control, that's needed to be effective in the environment. Nonetheless, the state-of-the-art evidence from neuroscience does nothing to disprove the idea that we do have control over our choices and that the choices are not determined. So, at a minimum, the current evidence is really consistent with the hypothesis that there is an indeterminist element in decision-making. Whether it's the kind needed for free will or not is quite unclear.